Imagine a world where the air smells of smoke, the ground cracks beneath your feet, and the only thing standing between life and death is a handful of grass. A world where the sound of rats scurrying in the dark isn't revolting. It's hopeful. Because for millions of people in medieval Europe, that rat could mean survival. This is not a story of monsters or heroes. It's the story of ordinary people, farmers, mothers, children, facing hunger so fierce that it stripped away pride, faith, and even reason. A story that reveals how fragile civilization truly is when the earth refuses to give. During the darkest famines of the Middle Ages, peasants found themselves in a nightmare that modern minds struggle to imagine. Harvests failed, grain ran out, and livestock starved. When the barns were empty and the fields bare, desperation became the law of life. People began to eat whatever could silence the growl of their stomachs: the bark of trees, roots, weeds, dogs, cats, and yes, grass and rats. But how did it come to this? How did hardworking men and women, whose lives revolved around the soil, end up eating things meant for animals? To understand, we must go back to a time when survival hung by a thread, when nature, greed, and human frailty combined into one long season of suffering. In medieval Europe, farming wasn't just a job. It was the heartbeat of existence. Every sunrise was a promise, every storm a threat. The peasant's calendar was marked not by holidays but by sowing and harvest, by planting and praying. They worked the same soil their ancestors had for centuries, owing rent to lords, taxes to the crown, and tithes to the church. Yet for all their labor, their reward was barely enough to live. A single bad harvest could destroy a family. Two could destroy a village. And in the early 1300s, the unthinkable happened. In 1315, the skies turned against them. Weeks of rain became months. Summer fields turned to swamps. Grain sprouted and rotted before it could be gathered. Salt, the key to preserving meat, was washed away. Bread became scarce, and meat disappeared from the tables of everyone but the very rich. By winter, Europe was gripped by famine. Chroniclers wrote of villages where people dug through the mud searching for roots. Mothers boiled nettles and wild grasses into thin green broth, feeding their children bitterness instead of bread. Dogs vanished from the streets. The leather from old shoes was boiled and chewed like meat. Some even scraped the mortar from church walls, believing it might contain flour dust from old grain storage. In towns, bakeries became scenes of chaos. People lined up for hours, hoping for a few crumbs. Those who couldn't pay were turned away, often beaten or imprisoned for theft. Starving peasants broke into monasteries and storehouses, only to find them nearly empty too. Even priests were dying of hunger. The church declared days of prayer and repentance, calling the famine a punishment for humanity's sins. But repentance didn't stop the rain. As the months dragged on, hunger twisted into madness. There were whispers of parents abandoning children, of graves being robbed for meat. Some chroniclers even recorded cases of cannibalism, though few dared to admit them aloud. And still, the peasants endured. In the silence of night, when hunger clawed at their bellies, they searched for anything alive. Rats, once despised as filthy vermin, became a blessing. They bred fast and lived everywhere. In barns, thatched roofs, and the grain bins of the few who still had food. Catching one wasn't easy. It required patience, traps, and luck. But a roasted rat could feed a family for a day. Grass, too, became food. People plucked it from the edges of fields, boiled it, and strained it into thick, dark soup. Some ground it into paste and mixed it with sawdust or bark to stretch what little flour remained. The result was bitter, barely digestible, but it was something. Those who refused to eat such things died sooner. Those who forced it down sometimes survived, but often grew sick. This was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and it spread across nearly all of Europe. From Ireland to Poland, from Scandinavia to Italy. It was caused by relentless rain but worsened by human choices. Feudal lords demanding rent, kings waging wars, merchants hoarding grain to drive prices higher. In some regions, a loaf of bread cost 6 times its normal price. And when the poor could no longer buy food, they became beggars or thieves. Whole families left their villages, wandering from town to town in search of charity. But the towns had nothing to give. Guards drove them away, fearing disease. Starving peasants crowded bridges and roadsides, collapsing where they stood. The countryside became a graveyard. The famine revealed the deep cracks in medieval society. Feudalism, once seen as stable and divine, showed its cruelty. The rich dined behind stone walls while the poor died in the ditches outside. Some nobles grew uneasy, believing that the wrath of God would soon reach them too. Others turned a blind eye. Even when the rains finally ended in 1317, it wasn't salvation. The next year brought drought, then disease. Malnourished bodies were too weak to fight infection. Epidemics followed famine like shadows, claiming even more lives. By the time it was over, historians estimate that between 10 and 15% of Europe's population had perished. And yet, out of that darkness came lessons. People began to understand that they could not rely solely on one crop. Grain diversity increased: rye, oats, barley. Villages dug new granaries on higher ground to keep food dry. Local markets grew, allowing trade between regions that once lived in isolation. Slowly, painfully, Europe adapted. But for the peasants who lived through it, the memory of famine never faded. Children who had watched their parents eat grass grew up fearful of empty fields. They stored what they could, saved what they earned, and passed down stories of hunger to their grandchildren. These memories shaped medieval culture more than any royal decree or war. They taught people humility before nature, and distrust toward those in power. It's easy, centuries later, to see the Middle Ages as an age of knights and castles, of kings and crusades. But behind those grand images was a reality most people never think about: the grinding struggle to survive. The peasants who ate grass weren't weak or primitive. They were survivors of a system that gave them no choice. Imagine the sound of a peasant village during those years. The constant cough of the sick, the hollow wind rattling through empty barns, the silence of fields where no birds sing because there is nothing left to eat. Then imagine one small fire in the darkness. A mother boiling a pot of green water, holding her child close, whispering that tomorrow might be better. Those moments, unseen by history, are what truly define an era. The courage to endure when hope is almost gone. When famine finally ended, the survivors looked upon a changed world. Villages were smaller, farmlands were abandoned, but the people who remained were stronger, wiser, and more aware of the fragility of life. They had faced the edge of extinction and returned. In the decades that followed, Europe slowly rebuilt. New farming tools appeared: heavier plows, better harnesses, improved irrigation. Lords began leasing land to peasants for fixed rents instead of labor, giving them more independence. And though the Great Plague of the 14th century would soon strike again, the famine of 1315 had already taught Europe one brutal truth: nature could humble even the most powerful societies. The story of peasants eating grass and rats is more than a tale of hunger. It's a reminder of how thin the line is between civilization and chaos. When food disappears, so does order. Morality bends, faith is tested, and humanity's true nature is revealed. Yet, even in that horror, there was a strange kind of nobility. People shared scraps with neighbors, prayed together in churches, and buried their dead with dignity when they could. The human spirit, fragile but unbroken, flickered in every act of compassion. So the next time you think of the Middle Ages, don't picture just kings and armor.